Hey guys, Chip Grinnell here with the Synoptic Gospels class for the spring of 2013. I'm doing my devotional presentation on the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. This story is found in all four of the Gospels. Today I want to read the story to you. It's found in Matthew 14:13 through 21, Mark 6:30 through 44, Luke 9:10 through 17, and the Gospel of John, chapter 6, 1 through 14. Today I'm going to read out of the Gospel of Matthew, the New Living Translation. And it says, "As soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was and headed and followed on foot from many towns. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. That evening the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves.' But Jesus said, 'That isn't necessary. You feed them.' But they answered, 'We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Bring them here,' he said. And he told the people to sit down on the grass. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up towards heaven, and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples, who distributed it to the people. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterwards the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children." I know it's a Synoptics class, but from the book of John, he says, "Tell everyone to sit down." So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. Then Jesus took the loaves and gave thanks to God and distributed them to the people. Afterwards he did the same with the fish, and they all ate as much as they wanted. After everyone was full, Jesus told the disciples, "Now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." So they picked up the pieces and filled 12 baskets with scraps left by the people who had eaten from the 5 barley loaves. We've all heard the story of the feeding of the 5,000. We see a miraculous thing happen in this story. Jesus takes 5 loaves and 2 fish and feeds 10 to 15,000 people. The Bible says that there was 5,000 men that were there. And the Gospel of John says, not including the women and children. And so we see Jesus taking 5 loaves, 2 fish, and feeding the multitudes. And then it says at the end, after everyone was full, that they brought back 12 baskets. Typology there representing the children of Israel. You could go off in 1,000 different directions on this particular pericope and go, talking about Jesus' provision for the people. He meets the needs of the people. He has compassion on the people and sees their need and meets it. Just goes on and on. But the thing that dug out of this time in reading it was the obedience of the disciples. The disciples are standing in front of a crowd of, again, 10 to 15,000 people. I traveled professionally as a musician for a number of years and have had the privilege of standing in front of that many people. And not only is it terrifying to be in front of that large of a group of people, I can't imagine standing there with a basket of bread and fish and expecting to feed all of them. But Jesus says, "Bring me the loaves." He says, first he says, "Don't send them away, you feed them." And the disciples say, "But we only have this bread and we only have these few fish." And Jesus says, "Bring them to me," and he blesses them and asks the Father to bless them. I recently watched the History Channel's portrayal of the Bible. Some good stuff there. It's pretty neat to see some of the stories played out in drama, but this particular scene, it was only a couple of minutes in the show, but it really blessed me, because the disciples come up over a hill and here's the 5,000 and it just kind of goes frame to frame and quickly goes to where Jesus is now blessing the basket, and he holds the basket up and asks the Father to bless it, and then it pans to one of the disciples, and the disciples looking at him as the basket comes down full of fish, and the disciple just, in that moment, you see the light bulb go off, and he realizes what's going on and that Jesus has just done another miracle. And so the disciple holds up the basket himself and blesses it, and when he brings it down, it's full of fish, and then it goes and they begin to distribute it, and to me that just spoke of the radical obedience of the disciples of Jesus, and how we as disciples ourselves today in this present day have to be willing to be radically obedient when Jesus asks us to do the seemingly impossible. Radical obedience to Jesus always produces something. We see the disciples being obedient to bring him the loaves and fishes. Jesus blesses it, it multiplies, they distribute it, the people are fed, a need is met. In our own lives, radical obedience to Jesus will produce something. In January of 2012, I heard from the Lord that it was time to go back to school. My wife and I have been in Virginia for the last 9 years, and we went to school there. We met and were married and have started to raise a family there. I was on staff as one of the worship leaders of the church and the worship director of the Bible college that we were a part of down there in Southwest Virginia. And in January, God began to speak to me that it was time to go back to school. We were rather settled where we were. Nice house on the campus. All of our bills were taken care of. We got a weekly stipend, and wasn't a lot of money, but we lacked for nothing. And when I began to talk to my wife about the idea of moving to Western New York, one of the conditions when we got married was that she would never live here, and one of my conditions was that I would never live in her hometown in rural Pennsylvania. But as she began to pray through, she realized that it was God's plan. And so in June of 2012, we moved to Lima, New York. I was born and raised about 45 minutes west of here, so the transition wasn't too hard for me as far as relocating. It was for her, but she was willing to be obedient to what God was saying. And so we moved here, and we've been here since then. I enrolled in classes in the fall and began to work through on my way to pursuing my master's degree at Northeastern Seminary. I thought that being in the perfect will of God would open the door to manifold blessings and all of these wonderful things would happen, but it's been one of the hardest years of our lives. And continuously I've asked the Lord, I obeyed you to come here. I know that you spoke for me to come here. I know that I'm in your perfect will. Why are things just so difficult? And then the Lord reminds me that He has met every single one of my needs. Not necessarily my wants, but my needs. And so my radical obedience to the Lord has opened the door for me to learn so many things this year, not only through the book learning and through the classes, but in my own marriage and in my own life and in my own, the way that I father my children and the way that I'm a husband to my wife. We're expecting our third child now in May with our third little girl. And it's been the hardest pregnancy that we've had. My wife has had multiple complications, and I've had health problems this year. And for the past 9 years, none of that. We've never had anything like that happen. The last few months, I've really solidified the fact that no matter what God calls me to do, I will be radically obedient to do it. And I believe that if we can be obedient in the small things, that if we can be obedient when God says, bring us the loaves and fish so that we can feed these people, that God will entrust us with greater things, the miraculous, the supernatural, the things that change people's lives forever. I think that as a generation, present day, we've tended to lose a grasp on radical obedience. We kind of come and go as we please in the house of God, it feels like at times. And I think that we need to hone in on what God is saying in this day and time and learn to be radically obedient when He speaks to us, so that we can put ourselves in a position to see the miraculous happen, to be able to provide for the needs of the people. If you're standing in front of a group of people getting ready to minister to them, and the Lord gives you a word of knowledge or gives you a word of prophecy for somebody, and you're radically obedient to give it, regardless of whether you think it's appropriate or right on, or you're not sure, but if you know that God's spoken to you and you'll be radically obedient to follow through with that, someone's need will be met. And oftentimes it may be your own. We've seen God supernaturally provide for our finances, supernaturally provide for our health. My wife was in a car accident after we'd been here. She flipped the car with the girls in the car, totaled the vehicle. The car was upside down. She shouldn't have walked away both girls and my wife, she was a few months pregnant at the time, walked away from the accident supernaturally. Provision of God was on our family's lives. There's been times when we haven't had the money to pay my tuition bill or to pay the rent or to buy food, and I'd always heard stories of people receiving checks in the mail or people walking up and handing them money, and things like that had never happened to me, but that's happened this year. People have walked up to me countless times and handed me money out of nowhere. It's just the most unbelievable situation, and I can contribute it all to the radical obedience, the hearing what the Lord's speaking, discerning that it's Him, and acting on it. And I would just encourage you, when the Lord says, "Bring me the loaves and fishes," to bring Him the loaves and fishes, to do what He asks you to do, to be radically obedient in the face of adversity, and know that and trust that God will supernaturally provide for every one of your needs.